So we could ask ourselves why we spend so much of our time breathing, why we have to breathe in order to stay alive. And fundamentally, the function of respiration is to obtain oxygen and to get rid of carbon dioxide. So it's a reason why we have respiration. So function to obtain oxygen in the form of oxygen gas and get rid of carbon dioxide, whose molecular formula is CO2, 1 carbon and 2 oxygens. So that's carbon dioxide. So when we talk about respiration, we can talk about why. What is the whole point of this? Like, why do we have to have oxygen? And why do we need to get rid of carbon dioxide? And it all actually goes back to the individual cells in our body and how they make energy. So when we talk about respiration, fundamentally, it has to do with what is called cellular respiration. And this is a chemical reaction that occurs in your body, inside your individual cells, and inside a part of your cells, which is referred to as the mitochondria. So this takes place inside inside the cell, or mitochondria. Most of our cells do have mitochondria. There are a few examples that do not. But this mitochondria is a separate little place where this chemical reaction called cellular respiration occurs. And so I'm going to write down just the basic chemical reaction, and we'll talk about it. So we have C6H12O6, which is glucose. So this means that glucose is a type of organic molecule that has carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen in it. We combine that with oxygen, and this produces carbon dioxide plus water plus a type of energy, which is called ATP. So this is energy. So now we see that we need oxygen in order to produce energy. We need it to produce ATP. So like, for example, when you're exercising, your respiration rate increases and you have to breathe more deeply. You have to ventilate more deeply in order to get enough oxygen, but you also have to get rid of CO2 because CO2 building up in our bodies is not a good thing. And we'll talk about why that is later. But just know that the reason why we breathe has to do with this chemical reaction that takes place inside of our cells. So we can talk about the processes of respiration. And this first process has to do with ventilation. So gas exchange occurs across a membrane. So gas exchange occurs across a respiratory membrane. But this respiratory membrane is very deep inside of our lungs. It's not like we don't have gills like on our necks, right? Like fish. So it's way deep inside. So we actually have to like get air down and then get air out, right? So we have the process of inspiration, which we breathe in. And that is a really cool word if you think about it, because to inspire is to take a breath in, right? And then we have expiration or exhalation. That's another word, an inhalation. So I put inhalation and exhalation. Those mean the same thing. This is to breathe out. How do we do that? Our body, because we're mammals, is very efficient at obtaining oxygen and getting rid of CO2 because we use metabolism, we use ATP to help to maintain our body temperature. So we can live in very cool environments, but we also can live in very hot environments. So we help it. We are actually what are referred to as endotherms, right? So we use metabolism to produce heat. So we have to be very efficient at it. And so we have, for example, a diaphragm. So this includes a muscle called the diaphragm. And this diaphragm sits underneath our lungs. And we're going to talk about the function of the diaphragm. But what it does is it changes the volume and the pressure of the air inside the lungs. So when I breathe in, it's very easy for air. It just kind of automatically flows out when I breathe in. And then I have to forcefully expire. I have to help to force the extra air out. So you might have heard of like clavicular breathing, where you breathe very shallow. And that is not a good way to ventilate your respiratory system because it leaves a lot of what they call dead air inside of your lungs. So diaphragmatic breathing includes using your abdomen and using the diaphragm, and it is a better way to breathe than simply breathing very shallow. So you want to just like pay attention. Are you a person that under stress tends to take sips of breath? Or do you realize what you're doing and take some breaths before or during or after a stressful event? So ventilation is the first process of respiration. We can also talk about this exchange of gases. So we can talk about the second part, which is what is referred to as external respiration. External respiration. So I'm going to draw oxygen being transferred from the air in the lungs to the blood. So there's my respiratory membrane to the blood. So oxygen gets picked up and CO2 goes the other way. So I write CO2 goes the other way. So this is across the respiratory membrane. So we'll put respiratory membrane. And we'll talk about how this gas, oxygen, has to be first dissolved in water in order to move across the membrane. And so it's really important for our membrane to be wet and moist and also thin, and there has to be a large surface area. So sometimes people lose their ability. Maybe they decrease the surface area, or their membrane becomes really thick and mucousy. And so that is a problem. Okay, so that becomes a problem. So the third thing is the transport of respiratory gases. Okay, so this is in the blood. So how does it be transported? It's attached to, for example, oxygen is attached to the hemoglobin. So this is in your circulatory system. And then finally, we have internal respiration. Oops, respiration. And this is where it goes from the blood into the tissues and then into the cells. So this would be oxygen moving in this direction and CO2 moving in the other direction. So this would be CO2. We'll put that down there. Okay. So those are the different processes by which we finally get that oxygen into the cells. So just think of oxygen moving one direction, CO2 moving other. We have external respiration, transport in our circulatory system, and then finally we get it, the oxygen from the blood into the tissues and into the cells.